Welcome. Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston, a congregation that welcomes you and extends a heartfelt and inclusive invitation to join us in meaningful worship and in service to the world. We greet all those who join us this morning, those in our sanctuary, and all the many online viewers from Victoria to Vietnam. Because of the uptick in cases during the pandemic, we have temporarily suspended congregational singing, but you will have a chance to read during one of the hymns later. We are delighted that our new music director, Dr. Jolie Rock, and our church's string band are presenting the hymns this morning. Please sit back, center yourselves, and enjoy our service this morning.
Here, find a house of welcoming. Here, find vision and hope. Here, be received as you truly are, unique and beautiful. Your journey acknowledged, your love honored. Let us rejoice together.
To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to reap, a time to hurt, a time to heal, a time to laugh, time to weep. To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to build up, a time to break down, a time to dance, a time to mourn, a time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together. To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to gain, a time to lose, a time to rend, a time to sow, a time for love, a time for grief, a time for peace. I swear it's not too late. To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And a time for every purpose under heaven.
Thank you, string band. That was wonderful. Please join with me in the spirit that some call meditation and others name prayer. Breathe with me the breath of life. Inhale as we share this interwoven, intricate web of affinity. Exhale as we feel one another's presence. Breathe with me as we gather to do the holy work of kinship and support. Open your mind, open your heart. This morning I share a Celtic Lorica by Maureen Killoran. Spirit of all blessing, be with us in the ordinariness of our days. May hope's light guard us and keep cynicism from our hearts. May the energy of laughter build endurance for the dark times of our lives. May creativity's vision grant the possibility of seeing old relationships with new eyes. May the oil of healing keep us from anger's hardness or despair. May the mantle of humility give courage to admit when we are wrong. May compassion's loom weave in us the discipline to forgive. May patience help us bear in mind that ours is not the only scale of time. May the flame of justice be a beacon for the choices we must make. May peace be ever in us and sustain our stressful days. Spirit of all blessing, be with us in the ordinariness of our days. We pause now together to lift up that which sits heavy and light on our hearts. Longtime member Rosita Kirkman died Monday night. Rosita steadily took First Church board notes for decades, was a driving force behind creating and maintaining the garden, and sang in the choir. A memorial service is being planned. Barbara Hopkins died late last week. She was a force in the UU network, and she and her husband Bob were members of both First Church and Emerson. The service will be at Emerson on February 19th at 2 p.m. Our condolences go out to Kathy Kinson and Dick Dowdy. Kathy's sister, Fran Scholl, passed away just after Christmas. And we had someone write in the book that we may be happy today. I invite you now to say the name or bring to mind those you wish to be held by the loving embrace of this religious community. They are part of the great cloud of witness and memory, and we will, even if we do not know their names, hold them in our hearts. In this great cloud of witness and memory, amid this beloved community, we hear these names and hold them in our hearts. Let us remember the suffering and joy amid and among our community that we do not know. We pause in awe and wonder of the mystery that is life. In the spirit of love, in the spirit of hope, and in the spirit of compassion, I invite each of you to enter into a time of silent prayer, meditation, or reflection.
Each week, our morning offering is shared with an organization that shares our Unitarian Universalist values, and through which we may live out our principles in the world. Today's organization is again the Center for the Healing of Racism, whose mission is to facilitate the healing of racism through education and dialogue in a safe and supportive environment in order to empower individuals and transform communities. Those in our sanctuary will find the instructions for text giving in the order of service, and those watching the live stream will see the instructions on your screen. Our regular Sunday morning offering collection invites us to weave a tapestry of love and action. We ask you to give generously, and an offering now will be gratefully received.
Please join me in reading the dedication printed in your order of service. To the work of this church, which is weaving a tapestry of love and action, we dedicate our lives and these our offerings. Our first reading is an excerpt from the online article, Oxytocin Promotes Coordinated Outgroup Attack During Intergroup Conflict in Humans, from a journal in the U.S. National Institutes of Health's National Library of Medicine. Conflict between groups is a recurring theme in human history. We tend to form social bonds with others who share the same characteristics as ourselves, whether that is nationality, ethnicity, or supporting the same football team. Individuals that belong to the same group as us comprise our in-group. All other individuals make up our out-groups. Competition and conflict with out-groups, from benign sporting rivalry to warfare, has a key role in shaping human cultures and societies. Such conflict often requires individuals to act in ways that harm their own self-interests. It also requires them to coordinate their actions with other members of their in-group. How does our biology drive this behavior? When small groups prepare for conflict with other groups, they often perform social bonding routines and rituals. These trigger the brain to release a hormone called oxytocin into the bloodstream. Known as the love hormone, oxytocin helps promote pair bonding as well as social bonding with in-group members. Studies in both humans and monkeys show that boosting oxytocin levels artificially via a nasal spray makes individuals more trusting and cooperative. But Zhang and others now show that the love hormone also helps individuals launch more coordinated attacks on outgroups. In a study, oxytocin did not make attackers less aggressive. Instead, it enabled them to better coordinate their attacks. Attackers who used an oxytocin nasal spray were better at tracking their rivals' defensive strategies than attackers whose nasal spray contained a placebo. Under the influence of oxytocin, the attackers timed their strikes to occur when their rivals were vulnerable. Over time, oxytocin users became better at coordinating their behavior with other members of their in-group.
The religious scholar, or better, the religion scholar, asked, "And just how would you define neighbor?" Jesus answered by telling a story. There was once a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. On the way, he was attacked by robbers. They took his clothes, beat him up, went off, leaving him half dead. Luckily, a priest was on his way down the same road. But when he saw the man, he angled across to the other side. Then a Levite religious man showed up. He also avoided the injured man. A Samaritan traveling the road came on him. When he saw the man's condition, his heart went out to him. He gave him first aid, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. Then he lifted him onto his donkey, led him to an inn, and made him comfortable. In the morning, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take good care of him. If it costs any more, put it on my bill. I'll pay you on my way back." What do you think? Which of the 3 became a neighbor to the man attacked by the robbers? The one who treated him kindly, the religion scholar responded. Jesus said, "Go and do the same." From Luke 10:29 to 37. Would you open your teal hymnals to page 1037? We get to do a responsive singing with Dr. Julie Rock.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For each time that our fears have made us rigid and inaccessible,
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
for each time we have struck out in anger without just cause,
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
for each time that our greed has blinded us to the needs of others,
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
for the selfishness that sets us apart and alone.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For losing sight of our unity.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For those and for so many acts, both evident and subtle, which have fueled the illusion of separateness.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
We are different heights, aren't we? And everyone else is they. This sermon title comes from a quatrain by the English author Rudyard Kipling. Father, mother, and me, sister and auntie say, all the people like us are we, and everyone else is they. This month we're thinking about reimagining the other. We planned our reimagining topics to reflect seasonal topics and commemorations. Thursday was Holocaust Memorial Day, and February is, of course, Black History Month. One commemorating people being exterminated for being different, another to increase awareness of the contributions of a people too long viewed in America as innately inferior. If you think that these are unnecessary, let me remind you that right here in Texas, Southlake school administrators told educators to teach opposing views of the Holocaust, and there are bans that exist on what state lawmakers are calling critical race theory. On the 19th of next month, it will be 80 years since 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were United States citizens, were begun to be forcibly relocated and incarcerated in concentration camps in the western interior of the United States after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That may have been 80 years ago, but just this week, the Washington Post reported that the San Francisco police marked a 567% increase in anti-Asian hate crime reports in 2021. The term othering describes the reductive action of labeling and defining a person as someone who belongs to the socially subordinate category of the other. The other is a concept first coined by the philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and popularized in more recent times in Edward Said's influential book Orientalism. The practice of othering generally leads to a polarization of people into two groups, an us group or in-group, which normally includes the proponent of an idea and his or her intended audience, and a them group or out group, who are the people who are used as an object for hate or mistrust. Well, I began wondering, why do we as a species seem predisposed to be wary of strangers and to dislike or even hate people we perceive to not be like us? Are we hardwired this way? Is it something we learn from our family, nature, or nurture, a combination? Broadway icons Rogers and Hammerstein told us you have to be carefully taught in the show South Pacific. You knew there'd be a Broadway reference at some point. The late 40s musical featured commentary on relationships between different races and ethnic groups that made producers really uncomfortable and nearly sank the entire production. But the composers refused to cut the song. Lieutenant Cable sings, "You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught." Well, this ruffled more than a few feathers in 1949, 16 years before the Selma to Montgomery marches. By the way, a production of South Pacific will open at Theater Under the Stars a week from Tuesday. But what if it's not as straightforward as that? What if we're not exactly hardwired to hate all the people our relatives hate? Our posterior pituitary sometimes releases a hormone and neuropeptide produced in the hypothalamus. Even Lin-Manuel couldn't set that to music. If you are familiar with the peptide hormone oxytocin I spoke of in the first reading, it may be because it plays a role in social bonding and in reproduction and in childbirth. Now, I realize many of you here near the world-renowned Texas Medical Center have multiple medical degrees, and I was an art major. But please bear with me. When I began thinking about reimagining the other, I remembered something I heard a while back about the other side of the coin, so to speak, of oxytocin. Oxytocin increases positive attitudes, such as bonding, towards those with similar characteristics who become that person's in-group. So, dissimilar folks become the out-group. Race may be the most obvious example of in-group and out-group tendencies. Participants in a study of race and empathy were given nasally administered oxytocin. They not only reacted more strongly to photos of in-group members with pained expressions than out-group members, members of one race were more inclined to help those of the same race experiencing pain than those of the other race. Wow. The effects of oxytocin are also evident during conflict between members of different groups. Those receiving the administered oxytocin not only defended in-group members more, they had more desire to protect vulnerable in-group members. And I found this next bit especially interesting because of our current political climate. When oxytocin is administered, people change their subjective preferences in order to align with in-group ideals over out-group ideals. A study in the Netherlands showed that oxytocin increased the in-group favoritism of their nation while decreasing acceptance of members of other ethnicities and foreigners. I often hear analytical UUs complain that those with different beliefs aren't thinking logically. I often comment, well, people don't change a belief they came to emotionally by using logic. But it seems this data also suggests we're chemically predisposed to align our preferences with our in-group, to hate all the people our relatives hate, or to also have NPR as the first button on our hybrid car's radio. If you are hearing these words and your takeaway is that you don't have to change hateful or unhelpful beliefs or opinions because you're hardwired that way, you're hearing me wrong. I may be predisposed to shop only on the pastry aisle at H-E-B, but I know better, and I'm going to keep pointing my cart to the produce section. What I am saying is that there will always be more reasons than we know why people don't think like we do or act like we do. And just maybe we can be a bit more understanding and less hateful about our differences. Is that difficult when they're not showing the same grace toward us? Of course. And being xenophobic because someone looks different may have been helpful in prehistoric times when marauding hordes of barbarians might attack. But in today's world, someone who looks very different may be more like us than someone who looks just like us. Now, this isn't a new concept. Folks were taught this 2,000 years ago. Arguably, Jesus' most famous parable is the story of the Good Samaritan. Even those who know very little about Jesus or the Bible have probably heard about it. Just this morning on the news, there was a story about a Good Samaritan being hit by a car while helping someone. In the parable, a traveler, whom we assume to be Jewish, is stripped of his clothing and beaten until he's half dead and rolled into a ditch. Both a Jewish priest and a Levite pass by but ignore the man, despite the fact that Samaritans and Jews historically despised one another. A Samaritan man who was passing by helps the injured man. Jesus holds up the Samaritan as the one we should emulate, not the priest or Levite. By the way, the Levitical priests were direct patrilineal descendants of Moses' brother Aaron, and the Levites claimed patrilineal descent from the tribe of Levi. An apparent case of people thinking they are very fine people because of who they are, and that should trump what they do. Which brings me to this point. Just because we don't automatically dislike someone because they look different, for instance, a different color, or are inherently different, for instance, a different sexual orientation, doesn't mean we put up with bad behavior. Saying we have to tolerate the toxic actions of a jerk because of some misguided attempt at understanding diversity doesn't do us or our community any favors. A month ago, way back last year, I talked about children and art, two worthwhile things to leave behind when you depart this world of ours. I also commented that they are also excellent catalysts for changing our worldviews. Because of time concerns, I left out the most obvious other example. I believe that travel very much expands our ability to see and understand the world and others. Mark Twain perhaps said it best in his 1869 book, The Innocents Abroad. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. I guess some things never change. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one lifetime. In a psychology article I read online, it told me that the fear of strangers, called xenophobia, is a broad term that may be applied to any fear of someone who is different from us. And that hostility towards outsiders is often a reaction to fear. There is typically a belief that there is some sort of conflict between the individuals in-group and out-group. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. identified fear as a major cause of war and prescribed love as its remedy. In his sermon, Anecdotes for Fear, he described two types of fears, normal and abnormal fear. He illustrates the differences between them through an example from the founder of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud spoke of a person who was quite properly afraid of snakes in the heart of an African jungle, and of another person who neurotically feared that snakes were under the carpet in his city apartment. Normal fear protects us. Abnormal fear paralyzes us. Normal fear motivates us to improve our individual and collective welfare. abnormal fear constantly poisons and distorts our inner lives. Our problem is not to be rid of fear, but rather to harness and master it. Now, you don't have to look far to find examples of xenophobia, the fear of strangers. I've been dismayed to find election cycle commercials already interrupting my happy viewing of Chopped and diners, drive-ins, and dives, trying to make the electorate as fearful as possible of others, especially others across the border, is apparently the goal. An incumbent governor seems intent on making immigrants sound as menacing and deadly as possible, and seems to be acting as though he's running against the current president. The former president was anything but subtle in his villainization of immigrants. Well, now, to be fair, there was a time when immigrants came to America, stole jobs and land, and murdered the local population. But people typically refer to those immigrants as the founding fathers. So, people who seem different, people unlike us, people from somewhere else, whether the crosstown school rival, a bordering country, or a land across the sea, may make us initially wary. But we put aside assumptions to get to know the individual because we acknowledge the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which, as I indicated earlier, doesn't preclude that person from being a jerk, but we have to get to know them to find out, which often takes listening when we want to be talking. Now, I have a technique to use when I'm tempted to make assumptions about a person, especially a person doing something I find questionable. I've shared this with you before, and I'll keep sharing it until I learn it well. Instead of asking, what kind of person would do that, I suggest asking, what would lead a person to do that? Asking what kind of a person would do that not only assumes the person is inherently different, part of the out-group, it assumes they had the same range of options I would have had in a similar circumstance. And so they made a bafflingly poor choice, perhaps because of a moral shortcoming. Asking what would lead a person to do that implies they may be part of our in-group and made a decision we don't understand, but we're trying to. I believe this is why judges and juries are easier on people who look like them and harder on people who don't. During seminary, I worked at First Street Mission in Fort Worth. Underserved people would come and get groceries or clothing, and unsheltered people would come for lunch and coffee. One very cold day in February, a woman came for groceries. She was wearing sandals. I remember wondering to myself, why in the world would someone wear sandals when it's so cold out? Which really is just another way of saying, what kind of person would do that? As soon as I changed the question to, what would lead a woman to wear sandals in the cold, a logical answer sprang to mind. She would wear sandals if those are the only shoes she has. A simple reframing of the question led me from judging a person for making unhealthy and quirky wardrobe choices to wondering what it must be like to not be able to afford appropriate clothing for all kinds of weather. Of course, that's a pretty straightforward example. It gets more complex when we wonder why people have certain bumper stickers on their vehicle or don't get a vaccine. Some people describe today's America as more divided than ever, including, surprisingly, during the Civil War. Though we live in one of the most diverse areas of the country, the divisions are stark and often antagonistic. No matter the topic, polarized viewpoints, inflamed by social media and a lack of decorum, highlight not only our differences, but our lack of understanding and patience for those who think differently. It becomes easy to devalue others' opinions, and then the others themselves. But the Unitarian Universalist first principle guides us to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person, whether we agree with them or not, or whether they're nice to us or not. We are asked to rise above the othering and xenophobia that, as we've seen, comes easily to us as humans. We are asked to honor that which is sacred in each person, even those we dislike and disagree with. We are asked to recognize that there is a sacred spark of the divine in every person. You will never look into the eyes of someone God does not love. Our Universalist forebears taught us that. It is really difficult to do this. None of us are going to get it right 100% of the time, especially now when we're all exhausted and tired of wearing masks and overwhelmed by a pandemic. But it's what we're called to do. And it's an important part of who we are. All the people like us are we, and perhaps nobody else is they. Amen.
Join me in the words for extinguishing the chalice, which you'll find in the order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of commitment, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
I end with the words of Dr. King. Hate is rooted in fear, and the only cure for fear-hate is love. Hatred and bitterness can never cure the disease of fear. Only love can do that. Hatred paralyzes life. Love releases it. Hatred confuses life. Love harmonizes it. Hatred darkens life. Love illumines it. Go forth in love and go forth in peace.
Thank you so much for watching our service today. We're glad you're part of our online community, where we welcome people who are diverse in faith, ethnicity, history, as well as gender identity and sexual orientation. There are many different ways you can get involved in our community. One you can do right now is by clicking like below or subscribing to our channel. If you're interested in joining our congregation, please email us at membership@firstgu.org. Thanks so much for joining us.